Today's episode is brought to you by Media for All, which was set up to help encourage more Black, Asian, and other ethnic talent into media, and to provide a support and mentoring network to ensure talent flourishes in the media industry that we all love. If you're looking for a mentor or would like to mentor young ethnic talent, check them out at mediaforall.org.uk, and it is all 100% free.
Hello and welcome to the Shiny New Object podcast. My name is Tom Ollerton. I'm the founder of Automated Creative, and this podcast is about the future of marketing. Every week or so, I have the pleasure and the privilege of interviewing one of our industry's leaders. And this week is no different. I'm very excited to be on a call with Timo Elliott, who is VP Global Innovation Evangelist at SAP. Timo, for anyone who's listening to this podcast who hasn't seen one of your presentations or doesn't know what you do, can you give them an overview of who you are and what you do?
Sure thing. Thank you, Tom, for this opportunity. So I'm an innovation evangelist. I work in the technology industry, and my job is to work with organizations on the leading edge of innovation, gather the lessons learned, and share that with our customers so that we're all more successful. I work for a company called SAP. Not everybody has heard of the name. We're the largest cloud technology company you may never have heard of. So the third largest software company in the world and the largest technology company in Europe. So my job is to work with customers, gather their stories, and spread those as widely as possible.
And before SAP, what kind of roles did you do before you became an innovation evangelist?
I worked for, I'm English despite my accent. I studied in the UK, Bristol University, then worked in Hong Kong for a while, then ended up in the HR department of Shell in New Zealand, of all places, and ended up doing analytics projects as part of that, trying to figure out career planning, helping with financial budgeting and planning. And then decided to go back to Europe and then stumbled across a small startup company that was going to help organizations analyze data better. So I joined that startup. I was the eighth person. And that was 29 years ago. The company was acquired by SAP. And so now I'm part of a 77,000 person company almost 30 years later.
Wow, that's quite the story. And what did the startup do?
So business analytics, so turning data into information that could be used for decision making. A company called Business Objects started off in Paris, of all places, and that's where I'm calling from today. I've been in the country now for 25 years or so.
So we're going to ask you a couple of getting to know you questions. So what is the most useful thing that you have spent your own money on that you use for work?
So I am joining you here. You can't see it, but I am in a pretty much a home TV studio. So you can imagine the scene. I have a big monitor in front of me, a nice camera, and 3 or 4 sets of lights that I use for doing presentations online as part of an Innovation Evangelist. I used to go to sort of 40 or 50 country seminars and conferences around the world doing keynotes. They all got canceled, believe it or not, or rather they moved online. And so I have done as much as possible to convert the conference keynote type presentation, but in an online environment. So I spent a small fortune in equipment to do that as effectively as possible.
And it's really difficult to describe how impressive it is. And I will try and share that blog post that you sent to me in the show notes, but really we're talking about,
go to timoelliott.com and there's a full list of how you might want to use it.
It is the difference between we're all like using Zoom, like crawling around on the floor like ants, but what your setup makes you like a giant kind of British museum. It's just absolutely huge. It's ridiculous. It's so good. But I was really struck by one point there. You said that you spent your own money on it. I mean, this looks like a heavy investment. Was there no recourse to get that back?
Well, the way I think about it is I used to wear nice suits on stage, and I would buy those suits in order to look professional. So in an online environment, looking professional means investing in camera and lights. I was lucky that photography has been a hobby of mine for a long time. So I already had a bunch of the equipment. And then once I got started, it was hard to stop. I kept wanting to upgrade. I did just recently retroactively get some of it expensed because I do use it hugely for work. So yes, I broke down just before Christmas and eventually expensed a little bit of it, but still only a tiny fraction of what I use.
I'm very glad to hear you say that. So next question is, I'd love to know a story where it's all gone wrong in your career, where you're absolutely red-faced and ashamed that it had happened, but actually, in retrospect, you're very glad that it actually happened.
Well, the best example goes back a couple of decades when I was junior manager in charge of a small team, and my boss, for some reason, doubted the numbers that he was getting from the finance system. So he asked everybody to send the salaries of our team to him so that he could double check the financial figures. I replied promptly to everybody in the department. And I knew what was happened because I checked in with email, and suddenly there was just 100 emails all saying, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry, Timo. You must feel awful, blah, 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 blah." I'm like, "Oh no, what have I done?" And my boss was absolutely fantastic, a great mentor, Dave Kellogg. He became a CMO and then a CEO, and now he's an investor in startup companies. So he took the situation and really just used it as a masterclass in explaining to everybody why the salaries were justified for the people. So he just took the transparency head on and used it to say, hey, well, this person is earning this amount of money because of this background. And really took a situation that was very embarrassing and sort of tense and turned it into something very positive. And not just the information he gave, which was excellent. It really did help me plan my own career going forward, but also as a showing how to behave as a manager when things go wrong. So it was an amazing example for me. Ultimately, I decided that I enjoyed working with customers more than working with staff. So I'm more of an individual contributor these days. But were I manager, that lesson would have been super useful.
So I'm interested in your perspective on bad advice in the industry. So you, well, certainly up till last year, were doing the tour, and you must, as part of doing talks, you see other talks, but also doing the online circuit as well. Less so, but I imagine you still get exposure to new ideas and new recommendations. So I'm just curious to know what are those bad recommendations in the industry that you hear that you don't approve of?
Well, the one area where I regularly spend a lot of time being a devil's advocate is when it comes to complex marketing systems. So just as a background, so my job as an evangelist is to talk to organizations that use our business software, and often they're relatively conservative. So my job is to reassure them or remind them that there are new ways of working, right? The world changed, technology changed, there are new opportunities. So it's probably a good time to take a step back and rethink the way they do business. And I give examples of other organizations that have already gone through that process so that it isn't as scary as it might be. Nobody wants to be first when it comes to change. But then I end up using some of those same techniques and skills inside the organization. We're a big company. We've been doing marketing for a long time. So part of my job is also to be an evangelist inside our company to evangelize that marketing has changed. The world has changed. There are new possibilities. There are new technologies available. And that if our plans are based on the systems that we've had for a decade, if we could take our marketing plan and just swap out some of the words, using Instagram or instead of blog posts, or TikTok instead of something else, then it's probably an opportunity to rethink a little bit more from scratch. And then sometimes, just like dealing with their customers, the systems sometimes get in the way. There are incentives and built into the KPIs about how you do things, and sometimes those systems get in the way of change. So the one thing that I see things going wrong is people have really complex marketing systems for how they collect leads and score leads and distribute leads. And then sometimes they're not rethinking how you could do that in a different way, given that the circumstances have changed.
And one thing I'd like to pick out from that is you said that you're also an internal evangelist, and I've done innovation roles in the past. And which do you find harder, internal evangelizing about the future and what's possible with technology, or external?
It's much easier to do external evangelism. Inside is much harder. So I think I'm a devil's advocate. So part of my job is deliberately being provocative to try and push people to rethink things. But the reality is that the situations are complicated. So often people listen politely and then go about their business. So it's not quite as satisfying as it might be when I'm talking to the customers themselves.
And so one of the things that I used to come across was the difficulty with innovation is that it sounds so exciting and interesting to begin with, right? Just as a category, but yet innovation was meant very different things to some people. You know, to just pull out some of the words you just mentioned, like right now, TikTok might be seen as innovative to one person, whereas someone else might see that reinventing a whole new product or category under the umbrella of their business would be seen as innovative. So where do you pitch yourself in terms of innovation? Do you mean innovation as a mindset or as a cultural or business shift, or do you see innovation as just tracking the most important new changes, or do you have a timeline that you're focused on innovation on a 10-year or 5-year period? I'm curious to know where your innovation sweet spot is.
So I should probably start with the background of my industry and my expertise, because obviously I'm going to really focus on what makes sense for my industry. So we sell business applications. So all that software in the background that makes the world go round, manufacturing, supply chains, finance systems, human resources, e-commerce, everything you need to support end-to-end business processes. And I was actually looking through the list of your previous attendees in your blogs, and many of those use SAP systems to run their business. So Vodafone, I think you had Kimberly-Clark, Heineken, L'Oreal, Nestle, and so on. So these, when I'm talking about innovation, I'm really talking about business innovation among our customers. They're trying to use the latest technologies to do something different. And thankfully, the technology is always changing, so there is always something new they can do. Recently, of course, artificial intelligence has been a huge theme for helping automate systems, discover new data, and so on. So that's what I mean by innovation. And then within that global picture, there are areas that are more interesting or more top of mind than others. So artificial intelligence, for example, is very top of mind right now. So I spend a lot of my time talking about that subject, and then in a way that organizations can figure out what it means to them. I was on a web conference this morning in Greece. What's nice about the current environment is that I can go to Greece for the day, just virtually, to do a presentation without having to leave my attic. And that was very much that, talking about how a small Greek mid-sized business could be using this technology to innovate and do something different.
So I'm curious on the AI piece. I was chatting to someone earlier today saying that, like, at the time of the inception of my business, there was all those articles that had the Terminator at the top saying, will AI steal your job? You know, it was everywhere. Terminator was everywhere, and steal my job was the most used title. How are you seeing the AI conversation evolve in the last 5 years? Are we moving from scaremongering to mainstream, or is the enthusiasm dying away? I'm curious to know how your clients and your audiences are responding to those two words at the moment.
It really is an amazing opportunity for our customers. And what's interesting for me is that I get really excited about the boring stuff. So invoice matching, right? This is not something that you're likely to see breathless articles about. It's, when somebody has an invoice, they get the information about the invoice, and then they get the information from their bank about that invoice, about what they send out an invoice to customers, and the amount that's paid is via their bank. And big organizations have tens of thousands of these, and they don't always match. And so sort of up to 20-30% of the time, a person has to go in and figure out what's going wrong. We can start giving that complex, repetitive decision to an algorithm. And it's not super exciting, but it works well, and it saves a ton of time and money. And it turns out the finance departments in particular are desperate to spend less time on manual tasks so they can spend more time on more strategic tasks, especially right now. Because of the pandemic, there's more uncertainty than ever in the business world. So finance departments are desperate to get more visibility into what's just about to happen. And that's another area where AI can help with forecasting and what's driving the current data. So just lots and lots of business areas. And obviously for different organizations, I'll go into more detail about what it means for an assembly line or for the HR function going, and typically with stories.
This episode of the Shiny New Object podcast is brought to you in partnership with Madfest. Whether it's live in London or streamed online to the global marketing community, you can always expect a distinctive and daring blend of fast-paced content, startup innovation pitches, and unconventional entertainment from Madfest events. You'll find me causing trouble on stage, recording live versions of this podcast, and sharing a beer with the nicest and most influential people in marketing. Check it out at www.madfestlondon.com. So we are at the halfway stage now, Timo. So we're going to move on to your shiny new object. And this is something that we've never had in 100 odd episodes. Your shiny new object is return on interesting. Could you explain to the audience what that means?
So obviously it's a corruption of ROI, return on investment, to return on interesting. So really, I came up with this notion to try and explain what evangelism is and why it might be interesting as an approach for marketing. So basically, I believe that marketing is useless in many ways. The organizations that will win the future are providing a great end-to-end customer experience, and customers increasingly sell to each other. So we live in a world of social transparency. If people like your product, they will tell other people. If they don't like your product, they'll tell the world. But this means, I mean, I can prove it to you. Have you ever used a site like TripAdvisor before going on a trip?
Yes.
Now, so why did you do that? Surely the hotel has all of the information that you might need. But
I use TripAdvisor to find restaurants. That's my use. I go somewhere like what are the top 10 or top 20 restaurants in this area? Take off the ice cream parlors, and the the thing with the awning at the front of by the seaside, and then you start to get to the good ones. So yes, that's how I use it.
So you're not looking at the marketing for those restaurants, right? You're looking at what the customers in those restaurants thought about those restaurants. And if you're anything like me, you actually drill into the reviews a little bit. So for example, I live here in Paris, and I'll look through the restaurant reviews, but I'm going to look at the restaurant reviews from the Parisians more than I'm going to look at the restaurant reviews from the American tourists, because I know that my tastes are more aligned with that first profile. Do you do anything like that? Or do you just look at the numbers?
No, of course. I mean, I'm a massive food snob, so I don't know how useful I am in the context, or I was before I had a family, in which case it all goes out the window, as you probably know. So yeah, I would look at the information. So I sort of try to balance what the algorithm and the numbers are telling me versus what, like, the soft stuff. Yeah, as you say, analyzing the language, or what type of person would say this, and do I relate to that kind of person? And that does shape my food choice. But then mostly it's pictures would be the way that I do it.
Oh, okay. So, so the
The
pictures, I
user.
guess that does come back to the marketing. But so
No, I know this is user photos, right?
oh, right.
So
There you go. So it is user generated content. So again, it gets back to the traditional marketing where people are basically shouting out. It's never been easier to shout. It's never been easier to get content out there, to do content marketing, but it's never been harder to actually be heard. So if you want to float above the sea of sort of expensively produced marketing mush, then you have to be interesting. Now, again, this is something that depends a little bit on my industry. I work in an industry where we sell extremely complex products that are directly related to business needs. So, it's not Coca-Cola or Kraft where it's a product that you're consuming as an individual. It's a product that you are going to purchase, you're going to install, it's going to be expensive, but it can give you big business benefits. But it's not a personal consumption. So the actual acquisition decision is extremely complex. It's not a nice picture of a server that will sway people too much. It's going to be arguments or things that pique their interest about what they can do with that product. So being interesting is, at least in my industry, an extremely important part of successful marketing in this new era where nobody cares about your company or your product. They care about people like themselves who are consuming that product. And that's true whether it's a can of Coke or enterprise software.
So I was going to ask you this question earlier. Evangelism's a difficult word. It conjures up a lot of negative emotions in people when you say, oh, this guy's an evangelist. And the majority of evangelist job titles I've seen have come from actually big software vendors, like Microsoft have an evangelist. Jeremy Waite was a sort of successful evangelist at IBM. It probably still is to a degree. But you don't tend to get an evangelist in smaller businesses where it is, as you say, buying a can of Coke or a pair of trainers. Do you ever come across any friction when it comes to the word evangelism? Do people sort of raise their eyebrows and think, who does this guy think he is? Because he's got this almost word with
they think that anyway.
Religious context to it.
They think that with or without the title, of course. So yes, it's a term that's absolutely more accepted in the technology industry than anywhere else. But so a little anecdote, I actually did look up the etymology of the word, and it turns out that it comes from an ancient Greek word, so several hundred years BC, Evangelum, and it started off as the tip that you would give a messenger who brought good news. So somebody would bring the better the news, the more you would tip the person. So it eventually became less associated with the money and more associated with the person bringing the good news. And then many centuries later, it turned into a different type of good news. So that's the religious aspect of evangelism, and that's how it's still used in a lot of countries. But in many ways, what I do is actually closer to the original evangelism. I am paid to bring, good news, in quotes, to organizations about how they can use technology better. To get back to your question, yes, I do have to do it slightly differently for different countries. So if I'm going to go to some parts of the Middle East, I might well replace it with advocate rather than evangelist, for example. It just makes sure that I don't have any problems at customs control or anything. But in general, it's a well understood term in my industry. And I think the concept, at least, works everywhere. It's somebody who is not talking about your products, but really telling stories about how people can benefit from using those products. I mean, it's not a new concept. At its core, it's been part of advertising for decades.
So if someone's listening to this thinking, I would love to be an evangelist, how do you get started?
It's actually the number one question that I get asked because it's a fun job and I would thoroughly recommend it. The downside is it's almost impossible to get hired as an evangelist because it's not a traditional marketing role. So the advice I usually give is you actually have to become an evangelist, you have to do evangelism first. So you have to carve out some time of your free time or part of your job and do evangelism. And then if you do it well enough and you get enough benefits out of doing that, then you will eventually be able to earn a living from it. But it took me a good decade to slowly carve out that role. And if I left tomorrow, I'm not sure that they would fill the slot with the same position. I sort of get away with it because what I do is appreciated. But it really did happen over time. What happened was I started doing things outside my role, either writing blogs or cartoons is a good example. I do cartoons. They're not that funny, but if you type in innovation cartoon or analytics cartoon into Google, the top of the list is my website with my cartoons. Marketing cartoon, I think I get on the list too, but I'm a little further down, maybe the fifth slot. But it's a good example of something that I did completely in my spare time, but it turned, and I make the cartoons available for people to put in presentations, and that's led to lots of great contacts that has in turn helped me with other aspects of my job. So there's this sort of positive spiral that builds once you start getting some of the things doing the right way. I'm sure you found the same thing with this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. And my experience of becoming an innovation director when I was at We Are Social was very similar. I didn't just like rock up there and say, I'm going to do it. I had to sort of, start doing it 1% of the time and then gradually build it up to the point of which that was all I did. But I'm interested that, well, my experience was it's an interesting job working in innovation and evangelism, I wasn't that by title, but it kind of had a glass ceiling to it in a sense that like once you are the innovation director or evangelist, then so where do you go to next? What's the next step up from where you are, which feels an incredibly lofty position at a massive company?
So that is a great question. So it's how do you get scale beyond an individual contributor? And that is a little bit coming back to evangelizing internally, about taking some of what I believe makes evangelism successful as an individual and then trying to repeat that at a larger scale. So, for example, one of the things that has been very successful for me is I get to talk to lots of customers as part of my job. And I firmly believe that if you have to engage in order to be engaging. Too many marketing people, I believe, work in their little ivory tower a little bit, or they work with personas, and they don't ever get to talk to actual customers. And certainly that's true in our industry where we sell to CEOs. It's relatively hard for marketing people to knock on the door of CEO and say, hey, what are you thinking about these days? But as an evangelist, I get to interview them. I get to talk to them on stage. I get to go to conferences and chat over coffee. And then I can use that to constantly iterate what is interesting. So whenever I'm doing a presentation, I'm faced with an audience. And my job is to be as interesting as possible for that audience, talk about things that I know are interesting to them at any point in time. Artificial intelligence right now, for example, it's not to pitch my products, right? That's the wrong place to start. So I'm going to start with what's interesting. And then I'm going to, obviously, I still work for a software company. Then my job is to figure out, well, how can I talk about what we can do to help people be successful in that area? So I'm sort of triangulating to get to interesting content, typically about how other organizations have used this software to do interesting things. But what's crucially important is that I don't necessarily know it's interesting. I think it's interesting because I've been working with these people for a long time, but I get to try it out on stage and I get to see people's reactions. So often I'll put something in and it just doesn't work, so I can drop it. Or the other way around, I stick something in a whim and it turns out that it works really well. And so I'm just constantly iterating. So by the time I get in to a few months into a season, if you like, I've got a solid body of content that I know is interesting. And it's at that point that I think we should do marketing campaigns. Once you know you have something interesting, all too often, I think organizations try and be interesting. So they like, what can we do? What can we talk about that people might be interested in? And obviously some industries do some testing and workshops and things. But ultimately, you spend a lot of money on something that isn't necessarily interesting. It might be shiny, might be professional, but it's just boring. I mean, the proof is there's so much boring content out there. We're drowning in it. I don't know about you, but all of those clickbait headlines that you just, I dread to click on them because you know you're going to click and you know that the content itself is not going to be interesting. And so iteration and interaction with people is vitally important for interesting and good marketing. And yet traditional marketing systems don't typically have that iteration built in. There's still the notion of a campaign. You do a campaign and then you move on to the next campaign. Whereas I think the notion of campaign can always get in the way of this constantly iterating, constantly on notion of being interesting.
So one thing that I'm really interested in is how do you, from a presentation perspective, gracefully move from interesting to product without giving the game away?
So there's two aspects, I guess. So one is I spend a lot of time trying to figure out what is interesting in general about a topic or an area. So, artificial intelligence, we could talk about what are the leading trends, completely independent of any software or anything that SAP as a company could do. So I'm going to use some of that. And then I'm also going to include, but still, that would be an interesting conversation for the audience. But at the same time, it won't be very useful for them, right? It won't be something that they can directly integrate into their jobs. So my job is to take those ideas and figure out how an area that we could help them in their daily work that is going to be of interest to them. And I can talk about what we do without being too blatant. I mean, at one level, they know who I work for. It's not like I have to hide it. But that's relatively easy, to be honest. It's working with organizations that have done interesting things or already gotten business benefits in this area and tell other people how they did it. And people are always interested in those stories. And then at the end, I say, by the way, that was our software that they used.
Timo, we're at the end of the podcast now, unfortunately. If someone wanted to get in touch with you about having you speak at their event or getting more advice on bringing evangelism into their role, how would you like them to get in touch with you?
So the website is timoelliott.com. Timo Elliott on 2 L's and 2 T's on Twitter or on LinkedIn, just about basically Instagram, TikTok, anything you like, just put Timo Elliott in and you will find me and you can link up. You can drop me an email directly at telliott@timoelliott.com. And I'd be delighted to swap stories, anecdotes, anything I can do. Big part of my role as an evangelist is helping other people become evangelists and evangelizing about the notion even of evangelism. So thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you so much. Hi, just before you go, I'd really appreciate it if you could take the time to write a review of the Shiny New Object podcast on Apple Podcasts or iTunes, whatever it's called these days, or whichever podcast provider you use. We're an indie podcast, so it would go a long way for us if you could just share the word and give us a bit of a support on those channels. That'd just be fantastic. If you haven't got time, that's also cool. And yeah, if you could tell your colleagues about the podcast, and also, if possible, don't forget to subscribe. And I'd love to hear your feedback. If you'd like to speak on the podcast or be a guest, or you think I'm asking the wrong questions, anything, I'd be super interested to hear what you think. So please email me at tom@automatedcreative.net. That's TOM at, I'm not going to bother spelling it. Anyway, you'll work it out. Thanks so much.